Waigu Kakasa, Waigu Fate. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Media Watch. I'm your host, Dr. Savi. And we were away for a week, but we're back when this time around with lots and lots of guests. So I'm pleased to announce some wonderful people that are spending their time with us for the next half hour or so, where we cover off the stories around the world. So I'd like to introduce you first to Puneet Gurwal, who is the newly elected Labour councillor for Hounslow West. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show, Sabi.
Brilliant. And also our good old friend, less on the word old and more on the word friend. He's a young chap. He is Navjot Sidhu, QC.
Nice to see you again, Savi. Great to be back.
Brilliant. And also our very sincere friend who has such an incredible knowledge. That's kind of building you up a lot, isn't it? Works for the Sikh Research Institute, based over in Texas. They have a UK operation as well, and Shimsher is closely involved in that by looking after all their affairs in the UK. So welcome, Shimsher.
Nice to be back, Savi.
Brilliant. Okay, so as per the normal format of the show, what we do is we pick a main headline from around the world. We follow that with another part of the programme, which is looking at general news that's effectively from the previous week. Then we look at Sikh history as well, but we kind of, that's more of the end of the show, This Week in History. Before that, we look at news from around the world in terms of Sikhs. So kind of the second half of the show, you could argue, is more around the Sikh perspective. But, you know, I always consider this programme as a kind of bridge so that we know what's going on in the real world. It's education, real world in the sense that there's a lot more going on that we need to kind of connect with and interface with, and we have a perspective that we can share with the audience out there. So let's start off with the first part of the programme, which is about headlines. It's more of a general question for all of you, really. We know about the sad situation over where we had the bodies of 3 teenagers who disappeared on the occupied West Bank, and that was back in June the 12th. Sadly, they were, they were on a holiday doing some kind of hitchhiking, and unfortunately they were abducted and they were buried after a very brutal sense of what actually happened to them. Any death is bad. There has been retaliation, and there has been also an escalation of violence. I note that there is a suggestion, and it's kind of being brokered by the Egyptians to try and come up with a ceasefire with the various groups. That's the current situation. Generally, the question I want to ask to start off really with Navjot is to say, why is this the situation? Is this a legacy of, you know, what's happened? There was an involvement of the British before in terms of what the state of Israel is and what's happened. Why are we still, after so many decades, suffering this kind of inhumanity between people?
Savi, this is a flashpoint in the world which we're dealing with today because of the deaths of these 3 young men and then the retaliation of the Israeli government. But in fact, you know, this history goes back a very long way, back to 1947. And the issue is an issue which every government in the West has had to grapple with, particularly the US,
right,
but hasn't found a solution to. And the solution really is whether or not there is a settlement that will keep both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, happy, provide the Palestinians with a safe and secure homeland, because they are a displaced people. And if you think about it, in many respects, there are certain parallels with Punjabis, too, who had to migrate from one part of the greater Punjab before partition, and now post-partition.
It's almost like those lines, those borders, cause people to be territorial, isn't it?
The problem is, of course, is that where there are such conflict areas and where there are very strong demands, whether they're religiously motivated, as in the case of the Zionists who wanted to have their own homeland for Israel after many hundreds and hundreds of years of displacement, or whatever it is that's behind it, once you start carving up geographical areas, it becomes almost arbitrary. You draw a line, just as it was for Punjab, and the line may pass through a number of areas and cause huge amounts of dislocation to people. Equally, in the Middle East, you've seen this with Palestine. So the Palestinian people continue to feel deeply and justifiably aggrieved about the fact that they still haven't been given a fair settlement for their own families and for their futures. And the Israelis continue to feel under threat because they think that their state is going to be destroyed by hostile religious elements that are coming not just from Palestine but from Iran.
I've got a statistic here for you. The statistic is from the Ministry of Information in Ramallah. It says that it's revealed that 1,516 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli occupation forces from the outbreak from September 2000 to April 2013.
And Savi, this is what fuels the anger. You see, we don't get to hear as much about the deaths and the injuries suffered by Palestinians, particularly vulnerable parts of their community like the children and women. That's not publicized particularly heavily. The media seem to feel that when you lose 10 Palestinian lives, it's not newsworthy. It's the same way that if you lose 10 Israeli lives.
This is implying a media bias.
Well,
yeah?
I'm afraid that a lot of Palestinians and a lot of people around the world, and we're not just talking about Muslim people, a lot of liberal white people who have been concerned about the Palestinian situation, who have campaigned in favor of a homeland for the Palestinians, also feel that whenever there's bombings or attacks by Israel on Palestinian territory, that the outcome is not reported in the same way it is if it's the other way around. And this is an imbalance. Look, we know, and we see it this way, a human life is a human life. Whether it's an Israeli life or a Palestinian life, these are human beings, and they are being killed in their thousands upon thousands upon thousands because an agreement has not been arrived at.
So
it's an urgent situation. We need to deal with it.
You know, it kind of goes to that old song, well, you're so old that you probably don't remember it, let's give peace a chance, right? Do you think people give enough opportunity for peace or negotiation or discussion, or do you think the anger is so high and the kind of emotion is so kind of, you know, enthralled in the situation that, you know, that isn't even on the table because they can't get to a point where they can consider a peaceful way of just sitting down and talking about it, and, you know, almost like a, you know, in the South African period where post-apartheid there was a period of reconciliation, but to get to that point there was a resolution, there was a point where people had decided that enough is enough, you know?
Yeah, so I don't think people do give peace a chance, like you said. If they had, then, you know, we wouldn't have these statistics in front of us, there still wouldn't be all these problems. So it's self-evident. If people were giving peace a chance, then things wouldn't get this far and they wouldn't have continued on for this long. I think there's got to be more resolution across in all different countries around the world, and the only way of manifesting that is if countries like this with issues are allowing, you know, some sort of unity, some sort of peace and resolution to come to the wall, because if they are, then other countries will learn from that.
Right. Okay, I guess maybe showing examples. Shamshed, you know, we've spoken about United Nations before, right? The role of that organisation, which kind of post-war was set up to suggest that we'd never have another world war. I would argue that we are in a world war situation right now. If you count up the number of conflicts around the world, it's kind of World War III, isn't it? You know, just not by that name.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of conflict, and I think a lot of it is fought on sectarian and religious lines. I think it's a huge global issue that needs to be looked at very seriously by all of the member nations of the United Nations. And I think it's something that's just going to continue to escalate. And a lot of it is related to resources, and it's related to geographic areas where companies want to exploit resources and oil. And I think that's been very well documented by numerous organizations around the world. And I think unless this imbalance is addressed, we're going to continue to see a lot of conflict.
I think you make a very good point about the fact that people tend to pick and choose their wars, don't they? You know, people will only go into certain conflict zones because there might be, you know, some kind of oil reserve there that they
Well,
won't
it's
get
not
access
just
to.
resources.
Yeah.
It could be strategically important. The Middle East, for example, has a lot of oil, but the real issue about whether Israel has been properly kept in check when it's been aggressive itself, if we look at the settlements in the West Bank and the way that the Americans have been impotent in the face of that, to persuade them not to continue with that sort of aggressive settlement process. The issue there isn't about oil. It's not because Israel's got oil that the Americans are interested. They're interested because the Americans recognize that Israel is a pivotal country in the Middle East, and that if Israel collapses or something happens to it, then the other countries that surround it may have an overbearing influence. The Americans don't want that to happen.
Right.
That may have onward consequence for resources, Savi, but the immediate issue is a political one. And whether, we talk about the United Nations, let's be realistic about this. The United Nations is, by definition, a world organization, but the powers that are important with the United Nations, who make the key decisions, are not the small countries. They're countries like America, like Russia, like China. These are the big power players. And unless you get them on side, you'll never have resolution. And a simple example of that, we've talked about this before, Syria, where there is such an awful situation at the moment, and it's continuing.
Yeah.
And because Russia, for example, will not get involved in a way to check what President Assad is doing, as a result of that, there is now continuing mayhem, and people are continuing to be slaughtered.
So people are not being brought to account. Let's move on to the next part of the programme, because there's a lot of to cover this week. in our 25 minutes or so. I wanted to talk to you about, I guess it's kind of, in one sense, is more of a corporate responsibility thing. You know, there has been a conviction, Rolf Harris, sadly, we all know him from growing up, the didgeridoo and all that stuff.
I don't think Puneet would know him.
Oh, no, probably not. Okay. Anyway, so it's a case in point that people spend so much time actually as part of a corporation that, you know, what eventually happens is they get, you know, a few years later for the misdemeanors that they've done. I think the case in his situation was 1968 to 1986, 12 attacks on vulnerable situation with women, etc. He's 84 years old. He has been sentenced, I think, for 5 years. My worry would be that how come it's not, you know, we know that it's not actually happening today, that there's kind of misdemeanors happening today, that we wouldn't have another 10 years' time find another particular person who we all love in the public domain who has been getting away with it. You know, we've already had the Jimmy Savile situation. What do you feel about that?
I think it's the, so yeah, as you said, he was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months. I think it's the corporate structures within them have fear embedded. So if somebody was being assaulted, they would be scared to go and then report it because they would A, believe they wouldn't be believed, B, all of the rest of society, what it would then put on them, the labelling factor behind that. So, you know, you're looking at somebody like Rolf Harris that a lot of people have put a lot of trust into. He was working for a respectable organisation. This shouldn't have happened. He showed no remorse when he was sentenced. But the reality of it is he's taken away the childhood of those victims, and that will never come back. And I don't say it doesn't happen now, it probably still does happen, but I feel that, or I hope that education and as institutions are now getting to grips with these sorts of issues and indecent assault, sexual offences, they are becoming more alive to it. They are, you know, putting in those checks that need to be there, and they are trying to make sure that if it's going on, it does come to light as soon as possible. But there's no guarantee. I don't say that the fear factor isn't there. It definitely is still there.
There's fear factor on a number of levels. There's fear factor from the person themselves, there's fear factor from the corporation, and also there's fear factor from the board itself to actually do anything and kind of like put the company in a bad name. The one thing I was thinking about when you were just talking there, I was thinking, yeah, education's good, but I was also thinking from a online perspective, you know, like, you know, you hear about all this kind of cyberbullying and stuff. How do we know that's not actually having an effect in corporates? And, you know, almost like making that person feel really, really bad and being bullied in the workplace. You know, I mean, that might sound different to the kind of sexual abuse that's happened in certain cases, but that's still just, you know, that is a misdemeanor in its own right, and that can cause stress and make people lose confidence and make them ultimately lose their job, or somebody else is getting some sadistic pleasure out of it, you know. I'm not sure whether the checks are in place for that, you know?
No, so you don't, I mean, you know, we had, not too long ago, there was the Twitter trial, so there are checks that people do go on and they do look that this is going on. But from a corporate level, I think it comes from the organisation. If the organisation doesn't have those checks built into itself, then it can go as an unknown. Right. And it's only when somebody then comes to light with the problem that it's then, you know, brought to the table. But I don't think that the checks and balances are sufficient or adequate as they stand.
Do you think, though, and I'd like to come back to you, Navjot, I'm going to come back to you in a second about Facebook situation, but do you think that ignorance is kind of, you know, like ignorance is bliss? And I refer specifically to the Andy Coulson situation where he's been sentenced for, a lot of law cases, unfortunately, but it's what's actually in the news, isn't it? They seem to talk about a lot of cases in the news. He has been jailed for 18 months, it's just been announced, for hacking phones.
Yep.
Is it pressure sometimes from some media outlets to get the latest news stories? But what I was particularly alarmed about, and I'm not sure who said this, whether it was the prosecution or his case or his opinion, I don't know, but there is a suggestion that it was ignorance. He didn't know that it was illegal.
Okay, so Savi, in law, and people should understand this, there's a basic fundamental principle, which is that ignorance of the law is no excuse and it's no defense. So what that means is if you commit a crime, but you don't think it's a crime, you don't realize it's a crime, it's still a crime. And so people will be brought to book for things that they've done, even if they did it in ignorance.
I have to interrupt you for a second, only because of the context of the fact that people may be doing cyberbullying, and I guess there's two levels to this. One, they don't realise it's a bad thing. Secondly, they don't know there's a law in place for it.
Let's look
so
at it this
it's an
way.
issue about, we don't know there's a law in place for it, so they can do it if you want to. And the second thing is, because he said, I don't know it was illegal. Right, so if you don't know it's illegal because there's no law in place for it, does that give you the carte blanche situation that you can do it?
The assertion that was made on his behalf by his QC when he was mitigating at the time of sentencing for Andy Coulson was that my client, Mr. Coulson, didn't know that this was a crime at the time he was committing this crime. The prosecution came back and said, that can't be right because, in fact, Andy Coulson had been put on notice by more than one person that what he was doing and what the organization was doing was wrong.
A bit suspect.
And so let's not proceed on the assumption for sure Andy Coulson didn't know that this was wrong. In fact, I believe the judge took the view that he must have known what he was doing was wrong, and he sentenced him accordingly. The point I want to make is this, Savi. This is not unrelated to the Rolf Harris issue when it comes to ignorance. You see, the culture that prevailed in this country and has prevailed for all of history until relatively very recently was that behaving badly towards children, abusing children, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse, is something which the state shouldn't interfere with. It's a matter for families. It's something for other people to resolve internally. And what's happened is that the state in this country, to its credit, and Parliament as well, has in the last number of 5-10 years perhaps, brought in legislation to protect children. Not only that, but the social services and child protection officers who deal with these sorts of issues have become far more aware of the kind of abuse that children go through. It's the same issue with Andrew Coulson, because I have no doubt that Rolf Harris said and would say, well, I didn't know that touching a child in that way was wrong. For me, it seemed like I was being just paternal or like an uncle. This is really important for us as people from an Asian background to appreciate. Because whilst in the UK, the English courts have caught up with the reality of abuse against children, I think there is a real question about the Asian community and whether we have become as aware of this as we need to be, and we are taking as firm a line on it as we should be. Because you know very well, Savi, that there are real issues about suppressed abuse that's going on in our communities. I'm not saying it's widespread.
And sometimes it can happen across different communities
Look,
as well.
if
You hear about that,
if a child is damaged,
somebody being groomed or whatever it is.
If a child is damaged, it doesn't matter what color they come from, what race they are. If a child is damaged, the child is going to be damaged for the rest of their life. Now, we have a responsibility, I feel, within the Asian community to root out this problem as well. And let me tell you how this arises. You know, we have these extended families. In these extended families, we tell our children, so-and-so is your uncle, so-and-so is your auntie. They're not actually their uncle, and they're not really their auntie.
Right.
Because in an extended family, we call everybody uncle and auntie, all right? The problem with that is, on one level, it's good, because it creates an atmosphere of community. On the other hand, however, it gives people, and it's men who are doing this, of a certain age, an excuse to get close to children.
Okay.
And then you see misbehavior happening, and then that can become abuse. And this is a real problem. I think parents in our own community need to be much more switched on and not so trusting as they have been in the past. I don't want them to get paranoid, but we need to move away from this assumption that everybody in the extended family and friends of the family all have good intentions, because sometimes they don't.
I would say that recently there have been, I think there's a society that are doing a lot more work to actually make it more aware, and to phone up and to ask for help and recognise those kind of issues. And even if it's down to a particular community trying to groom another community to do something in a bad way, or it's actually, like you said, within the family, there are situations like that. Now, I want to kind of move this on to Facebook was in the news, right? Now, the statistic here is that almost 700,000 people had their moods manipulated. Now, those of you who use Facebook will know that you get a timeline, and you can actually see what people are up to, and you can talk about what you're doing, whatever, and you can put links up. But they manipulated the timeline so that they could actually measure as a social experiment. Now, this is not an individual abusing their position, this is a company abusing their position. The press were particularly strong on saying the apology that was given by the COO was not a real apology, and I think it was something like, we didn't mean to upset you. So it was just, that was the statement, oh, sorry, we did it, we got the results, we published them in a scientific journal, but we didn't mean to upset you. So that's a corporation actually doing a misdemeanor, in my view.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a serious problem, especially when it comes to social media and privacy and amount of control corporations have to your information and what they do with that information. I think it's a really scary world that we're coming into in the 21st century with the proliferation of social media, especially younger children using social media, and a lot of the issues that you're talking about with abuse that happens on social media as well, and it provides a greater access for individuals. I think companies abusing that power is very, very scary. And I think as a community, as an Asian community, I think we need to educate our children not just about familial abuse, but also about social media and and how this can be used by individuals in grooming and other situations. And I think with Facebook, the amount of power that they have as a company and with other IT companies, I think it's something that we really, I mean, nobody reads the terms and conditions, right? Was it even illegal for them to do this? I don't think so. I think it's just an issue of principle, right? That they shouldn't have manipulated their power in that way. So I think it's something that really needs to be looked at very closely.
Do you think that we're manipulated differently as well? Because also what came up in the news recently is the possibility of airport security being tightened because apparently some of the evil forces of Al-Qaeda are developing some kind of technology that can go inside you know, your electronic stuff that you take on board, so you're not going to be able to take your iPods. And I think you were suggesting something more cynical going on there.
I think I was suggesting that a lot of this, sometimes it seems it's related to capitalism, that you can't take your iPad on board, but you might be able to rent one from the aeroplane, and you can't take a big bottle of water, but you can buy it on the other side of the fence. And
okay, so you think it possibly...
I think a lot of it is, there is this element of scaremongering, and I think, especially when it comes close to the elections, we do start seeing a lot of these stories. I think last week one of my friends sent me a story about how the UK is in danger of imminent terrorist attack, and I think we do see a lot of this kind of stuff close to the elections.
Do you think, though, as now that you're a politician, you know, do you think that...
I think...
Do you sit back in your party headquarters and go, this is a really pressing issue, maybe we should bring this up more? Or is that too kind of a cynical perspective?
No, I think it's very important not to diminish that there has been a heightened security factor at the moment because of this. And it's easy to say, well, yeah, it's all in good timing, it's near the elections and so forth, but actually, if there is a security issue, there is, and we've got to deal with it. It's very important. However, having flied soon after 9/11, I think security is as it needs to be at airports. I'm specifically talking for Heathrow, but any more would be too much.
Okay. Well, it looks like any more is on its route, en route. Sorry to use that pun.
What would that even look like? I mean, I think Heathrow can't get any more secure than it already is.
Okay.
Last time I went on a flight, I was
the day before to check in.
Yeah.
So your flight's tomorrow, but you know, don't forget to turn up the night before because we've got to go through about 5 hours of security checks.
But isn't it a sad state of affairs that we've arrived at? Those of us old enough to have been travelling by air for more than 2 or 3 decades who remember the days when you could get on a flight with the minimal fuss. Personally, I don't mind. I mean, I don't think the inconvenience is that great, and you've got to balance the inconvenience against a sense of personal security. So I don't actually have any objection to being checked and all the rest of it. But clearly, we don't want to live in a police state, and I think that there is an important balance to be struck by the state, how far it needs to go to cause inconvenience to individual citizens in the name of securing safety for the community and for the public at large.
And joking apart, you know, security is important. Let's move on to the next part of the program. We've still got a couple of sections left to go. I note that there's an organisation over in the States that have produced an advert for the first time, and it's like a 90-second advert. I have actually tried to get it downloaded, and we hope that we can see it in the next few minutes. If not, you might just see a screenshot in front of you as part of the post-production that we do for the show. So you should be able to see the video in the next few minutes, or just a photograph. It's about 90 seconds long.
My name is Waris. Sometimes people ask me where I'm from. Well, I come from a place where you can dunk a basketball, treat patients, sing on American Idol, be a Boy Scout, fly a plane, raise a family, ride a Harley, and serve the community. For over 125 years, Sikhs have been part of the American culture. My name is Waris, and I'm proud to be an American.
Let's talk about it for a second. Now, the reason for doing the video is quite a nice video because it actually has Waris Ahluwalia, who's an actor. He was in Inside Man, if you've seen that film. And in that film, he played quite a good role. It was, you know, something about being put onto one side as well. Hey, you know, what are you doing here? You kind of, you're abusing me, and you're not necessarily looking at the situation with that kind of a heist that was going on. But also it talks about the fact that Sikhs in America are pilots, and they are major contributors to society, and the fact that Sikhs have been in America for 125 years. And it's a wonderful advert because it does put into context the fact that the America that we know today is a land of immigrants. It isn't full of all white people and French and English. It's loads of people that have come there in the last 200 to 300 years that have made it what it is today. And we're recording today, which happens to be the 4th of July, which is their celebration of independence. I saw a really nice phrase recently. It said it's not about freedom, it's about practicing freedom. That's the distinction. You know, we can talk about, hey, freedom's great, but it's also important to practice it as well. So I just wanted to know, you know, your general views on, do you think it's a good idea to do that kind of social communication, that this is who we are, because it's so you know, because they might have had to do it because of the fact that
there are so many
mistaken identity situation.
There are so many negative stereotypes out there about different people, and as Sikhs we've had to bear our own share. Some of these are self-inflicted. Okay, I'll give you an example. The fact that Sikh people always get associated with drinking and over-drinking,
or driving trucks.
Leaving that aside, because driving trucks, there's nothing wrong with driving a truck if it's your livelihood. But the point is, negative stereotypes about the Sikh community is something that we need to address, and some of these are self-inflicted, okay? Some of them are not self-inflicted. Some of them are actually other people's perceptions of us because they want to cast us in a certain light. Some people want to make us into a troublesome community because they want to keep us in check.
Right.
When you hear about these stories coming out of places like America, that Sikhs who have gone there have actually lived the dream, the pioneer dream, of creating something out of nothing, settling in a country where they had nothing to go on except their own resourcefulness and their own diligence and their hard work, and that's what got them through. These are wonderful images, and we need to have more of these. I want to see a good impression given in movies from Bollywood about Sikhs, rather than the one guy, you know what I'm talking about, Sabi, the white guy holding a bottle of whiskey and dancing Bhangra. And in fact, some people may giggle and think this is funny. I find it actually quite embarrassing, because I always ask the question, is that the only image you can ever create of a Sikh in a Bollywood movie? Isn't there something else that you can show us to be doing?
I did actually write an article about this some time back when I was talking about the fact that it was, you know, not only necessarily the Sikhs, but it's also the disabled, or it's, you know, people who've got, and that could be a speech impediment or maybe a physical, they seem to pick on minorities rather than looking at the strengths of those individuals. I never call somebody disabled, I always call them differently abled, you know, and they don't look at the, you know, the massive contribution of the Sikh community, whether it be in the world wars or the freedom movement for India, and that is very downplayed, and you don't see a lot of that. I would like to ask you a question about the fact the other day I was on the back of a bus, you know, Health Watch, and a Sikh guy in it, and a brown person in it, and a white person in it. And there's a great website called Look a Singh, which actually kind of points out, oh look, there's a guy in the audience and he happens to be a Singh, or there's the postman in EastEnders. It's almost like, and it's a really interesting site because you get a lot of diversity being presented on that. But do you think like the councils today, and I think I was talking to you about this earlier on, and you're newly elected, right? Do you think that there's a clear kind of demographic when you walk into the room and you look at all your council members up there, you know, there's black, brown, yellow, green people from Mars. Do you think that they have done a lot in recent years for that?
So yeah, I think I can only speak really from our party's point of view, and we are the majority in the London Borough of Hounslow, having won 49 seats. But if you walk into our council chamber during a meeting, you will feel like there is representation of Hounslow as a borough. There are people, all religion, all ages, all races, males, females, and actually the divide between male and female is really very well struck. Probably not that is in politics nationwide, but it's definitely there. You do feel like you are represented. Sikh people are represented, Muslim, Hindu, English. So yeah, I definitely think we've moved forward.
We moved forward because we were backward before.
I think before it wasn't, people like myself maybe, or you know, young people, able people didn't think that those paths were open to them. And I think now as people are becoming more educated, more able, they're able to voice their opinions and say, look, I want to go and be there. Why can't I?
Do you want to be one? You said you want to be a councillor or a next Prime Minister or something.
I'd consider it, definitely. I think in the UK, I think we've been here a lot longer as well, and I think we're very much more integrated into society here. I think America, with that video particularly, I think it was motivated by bullying and hate crimes, and I think those issues are very serious issues for the American Sikh community.
Safi, can I add very quickly to what Puneet said? I think we've made a lot of progress, but we've got a lot further to go. Shall I tell you why? Right. It's not just a question of having representation of different communities. It's the quality of representation. You've got Puneet here, who actually, you know, qualified to the bar as a barrister, now as a councillor. I've been a councillor in Ealing in the 1990s. We really need more people who come from the younger generation, because it's not simply a question of walking into a chamber and seeing brown faces. Who are the brown faces? Are they able to articulate a cause? Are they able to argue for resources? Are they able to represent the concerns of their constituents? Have a look at the people that we've got and ask yourself, with MPs and councillors, generally speaking, do you feel that you've got the best quality of representation from the Asian community?
I would say that it's a thankless job in many senses because you don't get paid a lot. You have to put a lot of extra hours in. I would also say there's, a situation where, you do have people that have been there for a while, okay, and they like that position, they like to be there. If they're driving change, that's great. If they're not driving change,
The problem is,
then
the problem is a lot of
allowing
people are not driving, and